And what we've heard today thus far is that as we come out of this recession, tech is going to be leading. There are lots of opportunities for technology. It is going to be an important part of California's recovery, but also there are issues of equity, of spreading the gains. I mean, there's this meme that a rising tide lifts all boats, but apparently doesn't always lift all boats. And that's what we've been seeing the last decade in terms of increasing inequality. So our next keynote is with Damien Goodmon, and we're going to talk about that and how does one bridge that gap. So let me begin with an introduction for Damien. Damien, so Damien is the founder and executive director of the nonprofit Crenshaw Subway Coalition, which was the successor to the Citizens Campaign to Fix the Expo Rail Line. And it is a stakeholder group that represents the area of Crenshaw, Leimert Park, and Hyde Park, those neighborhoods in South Los Angeles. And their mission is to highlight the issues of equitable and community-centered planning and development in pursuit of racial and economic justice for South Los Angeles. And as a result of the organization's efforts, over $1.5 billion additionally have been invested in mass transit infrastructure in southwestern Los Angeles, including Leimert Park Village and Ferndale stations of the Crenshaw LAX light rail line. Damien is a graduate of Loyola High School, studied at the University of Washington, where he was a player on the nationally ranked Huskies football team. We won't have a discussion about UCLA versus University of Washington football, but he's a fourth generation Angelino and a descendant of Charles and L.M. Blodgett. And I'm going to digress twice on this. First, to say that if you want to know about the history of Los Angeles, and in particular the African-American experience in Los Angeles, I urge you to go and read about Charles and L.M. and their father and their relatives. It is fascinating and instructive. So Mr. Goodmon lives in Leimert Park, former co-chair of the community's High Neighborhood Council. His family has lived in South Central Los Angeles for over 110 years. He's the author of Get LA Moving Plan, has been trained by the Midwest Academy, Camp Wellstone, and the 21st Century Democrats, and is a recipient of the 2008 LAUSD Trailblazer Award, the 2012 New Frontier Democratic Club Community Service Award, 2013 Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Greater Los Angeles Drum Major for Justice Award, 2013 Black Women for Wellness Soldier Award, and 2017 LA Urban Policy Roundtable Spirit of King Award. And you can read the rest of the biography in the program, quite an extensive biography, but I just want to, before we turn to a discussion, Damien, as I say, I'm fascinated by your family history. L.M. and Charles Blodgett, so I just want to tell a little story here. L.M. and Charles Blodgett were bricklayers. They founded a construction company. They built many of the houses in South LA and moved to South LA. And they, along with some other folks, started Liberty Savings and Loan, the first African-American owned savings and loan west of Denver. And when the Great Depression happened, the regulators were going around closing down banks that were insolvent. They couldn't believe that a Black-owned bank would be solvent. And so they were coming to close down Liberty. And so LM was the CEO at the time, and he was interviewed on this. And I just want to quote this because I think this is great. He says, one of the men said, "You can't fight against the government. You know we'll lose." I replied, that's L.M. Blodgett, that if we answered on his terms, we had already lost our case. So, Damien, welcome to UCLA. Welcome back to UCLA. And clearly, you come by your activism honestly and from a long line of activists. So let's begin with kind of the overarching question. And that is that technology is a growth sector in California. It has been over the last 10 years, but we've seen increasing inequality, right? And so that leads to a question of what, in your view, is the responsibility of the tech industry towards the rest of the Los Angeles community, and particularly underserved communities? Do they have a responsibility, or is it just to their shareholders and investors?
Well, Jerry, it's good to be here. I know we've been meaning to connect. I have always loved the work that you've been doing, the scholarship that's coming out of UCLA on so many issues, and I'm just pleased to be here at this time in our history to talk about this interesting dynamic, this interesting tension that exists. You gave my family a lot of kudos. I appreciate it. My orientation in so many respects comes from both that understanding of the need for space and place, and a rich belief and need to extend that legacy with the work that we're doing now. I think in general, we have seen, especially in the Crenshaw area, in the West Adams area, right? There's this crescent that's around Culver City that begins around West Adams and Crenshaw, and then also includes Inglewood, that is a place that's seeing the largest increase in home values of any part in the city, in the case of West Adams and the Crenshaw communities, and in the county, in the case of Inglewood. And that is largely a product, I think, of the growth in the creative industry in Culver City and Playa Vista. And to see those impacts on these areas that have traditionally been underinvested in both by the public and private sector. And again, this is not, it should not come to a surprise. We've seen this take place, especially in the Bay Area and Seattle and other places. So on a community level, right? And we begin with the community level, and then we can build up a little bit to a more broader society level. On a community level, I think there are very difficult conversations that need to be had that can't be had outside the context of this overall system that we operate in. A system where job opportunities and land values in areas that were traditionally underinvested in have become a new frontier, but occupied, right, by existing low-income residents, people of color. And whether those industries, and it's very distinct and different, right? South Central has a great history of, especially through aerospace and other industry, of seeing factories come in that provided opportunities for jobs for the existing residents that were still being discriminated against in the broader context of America racially, but provided jobs, good jobs that created enough wealth to purchase homes, build a middle-class family, build a working-class family. That's not happening. And it gets to so many things, right, that are happening from our perspective internally within the industry, and the more or less silo that these conversations had been had, or at least I could say were being had, or narrow conversation that would be had prior to, the national conversation post the George Floyd murder. And so when we start to talk about, just on a community level, legitimate questions need to be asked about how, when Culver City expands its creative arts, technology, Apple, Beats, I forget how many are coming in that Hayden track and directly adjacent, how they don't do harm to communities that have historically been harmed, right? And then on a societal level, you're seeing this, what I call this trifecta, that is automation, artificial intelligence, and global climate catastrophe, that is leading to greater insecurity of those that have, again, historically been marginalized. Now, it's not, in the case of automation and AI, it's not just us, right? We're looking at tens of millions of jobs being lost within the service sector, but also in the professional class, right? As technology will come online, that'll allow people to be more efficient than an attorney, right? Leading to reductions in that professional class as well. But it nonetheless leads to systemic expansion of these systemic inequalities where wealth is further being given to those that are in a more elite class. And so on that broader level, right, you would think about these concepts that you see, like with the Alaska Permanent Fund, where this wealth is created through oil, that it is shared more broadly among the community. Andrew Yang, the famous Democratic Party nominee or nominee candidate, had talked about a people's dividend, forgive me for missing the term, but much broader than that, right, is necessary to address the path that we're going. And so can tech, especially since that's going to be the major growth sector, everything's more moving toward that, can they be leaders in that dialogue? Can they be those that legitimately lift up these conversations, to have honest dialogues, not exclusive to a particular company or even to the limited industry, but having them in the context of the broader societal impact, which is disproportionately harming those that have always been marginalized, disproportionately affecting those that are Black and brown.
So you touched on a number of points that I'd like to drill down on. And one was the mention of the aerospace industry. I mean, the aerospace industry really created the middle class here in Los Angeles, right? And though, as you correctly point out, there was a lot of discrimination, still what you needed was mechanical skills. And everyone worked on repairing their own car. Everyone had mechanical skills. So there was some democratization in that sense, that the skill levels were fairly broadly distributed. When we're talking about technology, we're talking about cognitive skills, things that you don't learn in the garage with dad. And there are real differences as you look across Los Angeles in terms of that. And I mean, South LA has, some bright spots like the Fauché Learning Institute, but not many. So how does the tech industry connect up with underserved communities, not just South LA, but other less affluent communities in the city of Los Angeles, to kind of span that gap to create that more or less equality of skills of folks who potentially can go into the tech industry or into other technologically sophisticated fields? Do you have thoughts on how that might happen?
Well, I mean, I think there are those that are creating and have been advancing conversations about pipeline programs. Just here in the Leimert Park community that I call home and have called home for over 27 years, we have this amazing organization called Tech Leimert, Technology, Entertainment, and Culture, that is about creation of or bringing together the knowledge of those that are within, maybe working for different companies in the broader context, or the broader, much larger companies, and bringing it here to try and develop the capacity of tech entrepreneurs that are people of color. And again, finding ways in which they can integrate within it are important. You mentioned Fauché, so finding how we can develop those pipeline programs from the high school level to the community college level to get people ready to go into these jobs is obviously, that's obvious. But I think in some respects, you do have to have an uncomfortable conversation about an industry that has got a reputation of not being so great for women, not being so great for those that are people of color that aren't migrant workers from other parts of the world, the best of the best coming from Southeast Asia or wherever, right? And when you begin having those conversations, and I know this is an Anderson School conversation, you begin talking about sociological issues. You begin talking about biases that exist among those. You begin to talk about, just in the context of why certain tech companies are able to get further along than others, just general bias, right? We had a very interesting conversation. I won't say which company it was, but they're bringing in their headquarters into South Los Angeles, and they're coming to a place and they're redeveloping a place that it was formerly industrial and no longer had great use there. And they've got a great product, no doubt, led by great men, three great men. But you can't believe that others that are my complex or women could not have got. And we had that dialogue with that one of the three founders of the company, and kind of said, very directly, if we had the same access to capital, the people who are doing the exact same thing that you're doing might be able to have a better opportunity to be building our own headquarters in the space, right? So is venture capital as open with those that are women? Is venture capital open to those, just women, right? Let alone women of color, Black and brown folk, when they're looking at investing in tech? I think that's obviously no. And no pipeline program, you can juice up Fauché and Dorsey and Crenshaw and provide those great job opportunities. No pipeline program is going to address that implicit bias, that the reality that we're living in a country that does not necessarily provide people that look like me the same opportunity as those that look like others, right? So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think this is now the time to have those difficult conversations about getting people to recognize those biases, about getting people to, yes, make those investments in these programs, but also take that inner look into the culture, the mindset of the executives and C-suite, on down to their hiring practices. Often, I forget which company it was, they were using algorithms to evaluate resumes before they got to a review level, and found that even the algorithm that was being used was culturally biased. And so, I'm glad we had this conversation, Jerry, at this time, right? Versus the many times we've reached out and not been able to bring it together years ago, because I think now we're in a space where more are recognizing the need to have it and are equipped to have robust and full conversations about what companies and industry can do to address it.
Yeah, so, large companies like Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and the like, they have pretty good margins. They have outstanding margins. And so they have the ability to invest in these kinds of activities. But, most of the growth that we see, particularly in Silicon Beach and as it extends out towards your current neighborhood, is in small companies where they are venture capital funded. They're not yet making a profit, but they have a good business plan and good prospects. But that is kind of where the exciting part of new technology is. So how do they engage? I mean, is there I suspect there's no structure now, but what structure could you envisage that would enable them to engage in kind of not just spreading the wealth, but spreading the knowledge into underserved communities in Los Angeles?
Well, I think some of it just begins with listening, but really listening, not just participating and having conversations for the purpose of trying to advance a project or product, right? But begin listening really intensely to those and evaluating and analyzing whether something is just not leading to people that are of a different class or different color being involved in the award of terms that are favorable, and even looking at the terms, right, of some of these venture capital investments. Allow me to say it this way: if firms are able to provide the terms that are being able to be provided to those that have a little bit more of a runway for whatever reason, and again, we talk about systemic oppression, we talk about the wealth gap, but we talk about the inability to back up. I mean, the famous statement, right, kind of came from our president in the last election. I just started off with a small $10 million loan from my dad, right, and that was supposed to be something that was just a throwaway, right? If the runway for people who are coming from South LA, people who are Black and brown, for women, is not as long, well, then maybe the terms need to be different. And I understand that's not necessarily something that is quote unquote good business practice, but if we're talking about addressing systemic problems, if we're talking about addressing an absence of performance or opportunity for those that don't make up the vast majority who are getting these investments, then we've got to have that deep dive. We've got to go into that. We've got to have that conversation more further. We've got to put things on the table that have been to date considered unconventional. That said, getting back to the conversation, just beginning the dialogue, right? Coming into communities and saying and evaluating and doing the asset map with community, not bringing in folk who think they know the community, but really listening to the community. And I think I've seen several things take place. I'm really enthused by, I think it's called the Bloomfield Project by the Immersion Collective, with the spouse of, or the widow of Steve Jobs, really making a concrete investment in East Palo Alto to really just spend a lot of time building something that was going to address that rapidly changing East Palo Alto community they've been involved in and lived in for decades. And I think just at its base, the project is about listening to those East Palo Alto residents who have not been, who don't necessarily see the expansion of tech in a beneficial light, who have seen their quality of life in so many respects, because of the increase in housing, diminish, even though they're surrounded by opportunity, right? Or in the context of opportunity, they're surrounded by nice and shiny things. And it's a long project. It's a lot of money. But in the larger scheme of things, it's not that big, right? And so, you start talking about $1 trillion companies. What can a $1 trillion company, the Apples of the world that are coming to my directly adjacent community to Crenshaw, and they're building their headquarters, the headquarters are being built right now for one of their offices. What can Apple do to address these problems that are happening in Crenshaw? What can Apple do to build the relationships and create the opportunity for this already created a community of Crenshaw to be integrated in part of the change, right? So we'll be looking to have those conversations. I can guarantee you, Jerry. You've begun them already, and we'll come back and hopefully have good results to tell you about.
So let's go back to something that you mentioned in your first comments, and that is gentrification. So, as the tech industry expands and it expands eastward, it creates a demand for housing in the neighborhoods that are adjacent to where the tech industry is locating, and you've already given some examples of its movement eastward into your neighborhood. The concept of gentrification sort of broadly is that neighborhoods are improved with increasing amenities, but that makes them more attractive, increases the demand, raises the price of housing. If you own a house there, then you have a capital gain. But if you're a renter, and maybe a long-time renter, you find that a community that you have lived in for quite a while is no longer affordable, and you have to find a place to move to. So there's a real tension there. And how does one think about that tension? Because as the tech companies move in, there's going to be changes to the neighborhood almost regardless. So what can they do? What can policy do with regards to the ultimate gentrification that's going to happen as the tech industry becomes larger and larger here in LA?
Well, I mean, it's a significant concern of ours. One of the major projects that really ignited, I would not just say Black Los Angeles, but several throughout Black America, is the Crenshaw Mall, where CM Group, which is this major development company, had announced that they had entered a purchase and sale agreement to acquire the Crenshaw Mall, and that they sought to bring in the creative office and tech that we were seeing to the east. I think they even specifically referenced Culver City and Playa Vista. And that tension that was established, that tension that created within the community, that the opposition, was because people have experienced and have seen the increase in housing prices directly adjacent to Culver City and in other communities, in this iconic asset, this iconic economic asset or center of commerce for Black Los Angeles, as though it was being lost to an industry that was not going to be necessarily favorable, wasn't for us. And so I think in so many respects that we as the Crenshaw Subway Coalition, an organization that works on advocacy that deals with housing, kind of went into a room in 2019 and basically said we've got to stop playing whack-a-mole. You know, taking and negotiating on bad turf. And I have to admit that some of the dialogue was in so many respects aided or egged upon because we had seen that another entry into the community that we had advocated for, the Crenshaw line, was also something that was leading to gentrification. And that gets to the broader point, Jerry. I mean, it is about tech, but it's really about the hyper-commodification of housing, right? Where any significant investment, be it from the public sector or the private sector, into an area with historically undervalued real estate, whether it's commercial or residential or both, can lead to a displacement of the marginalized peoples that occupy it, let alone if the improvement in the case of transit is for those that have been marginalized to be part of a broader system, right? And so even if you get to, we're bringing, or even if you get to a point where you believe that you should be creating new opportunities for larger companies to come in so that folk can get some economic mobility and jobs, you're seeing that actors throughout the globe from their pajamas in Singapore see that it is an opportunity to buy a multifamily property, evict the low-income paying tenants and elders, to put those who make more in there so they can generate more revenue. So we as an organization basically said the solution to this is not to necessarily have divestment and decay, right? Push out capital entirely, or investment and displacement, but to get as much as we could off of the speculative market as quickly as we can, right? Figuring out how public and private resources of a substantial sum could be dedicated, as we see in other parts of the world actually, towards acquiring the multifamily properties and even the single family properties to put them into what's known as a community land trust that holds a 99-year ground lease on the property, has its restrictions on resale so that it maintains its affordability going forward. And believing that if we were able to create a certain level of stability in our community, and that's why, again, we said it's got to be big. It's got to involve lots of institutional investors. It's got to involve potentially some of the tech companies that are coming in that have this impact. It's got to involve the public sector. That if we're able to stabilize home values and if we're able to stabilize rents, then the fight that is taking place regularly, be it big tech or new market rate housing, which also, unleashes a wave of housing increases, or stadium in the case of Inglewood, would be a little bit less difficult. It would not be as pronounced, but that absence of it and the ability for those, again, using the multifamily building, and this is not theoretical, you can go on crowdfunding websites and see rent-controlled multifamily housing show expected increase in incomes that are well beyond what the rent control in the city of Los Angeles would allow. And it's because those throughout the country, those that are in their pajamas in Singapore, can invest in that displacement. So the solution to that, in so many respects, for us as we have seen it, is just simply not allow that. Push the policy so that when apartment buildings are sold, the tenants, the nonprofit partners, and or the government themselves can acquire them and take them off the speculative market, invest in the stabilization fund or the impact fund so that it can be done at a large level. And then when that stability is created, then it will allow us, especially as we go into the latter part or future years as tech expands, it will allow us to have a lot more stability for those that have made up the economically diverse Crenshaw community and the culturally diverse, or economically diverse city and the culturally diverse Crenshaw community.
So you're seeing this as city policy in partnership with the tech industry.
It's got to have, the interesting thing when you begin looking at investment in the creation and preservation of affordable housing is that sometimes the public dollars are more difficult to deploy than the private ones. And so, we've been looking at the impact funds and social responsible investors to be involved in this with us, and do it from a standpoint where we're not necessarily looking for a grant, right? Because those resources are limited, but that we're looking for those that would take more reasonable terms. But yes, it would involve, and when you begin talking about taking tens of thousands of units off the speculative market, just within the mid-city West Los Angeles, mid-city West Adams, Crenshaw, Inglewood area, it will require far more money than you would expect an allocation from the city. That was pre-COVID. I mean, the checks that are coming out of the feds now might provide some good startup money on that, and financing and capital that can be allowed to be done at a big level. And we are working on that. The COVID-19 response that's coming out of Healthy LA is amazing. And we've been able to hear both from our federal officials, state and local, that these conversations that were had a year ago and were literally moving very slowly, if not going nowhere, are advancing on fast track. But it could and would involve corporate partners who just simply would be seeing their resources not provide as high a return, but would have a major community benefit,
Yes, so one of the attractive aspects of South LA that your ancestors were actually involved in building is its low density. And there's a lot of single family homes. They may be multiple families or extended families living there, but a lot of single family homes, low density neighborhoods. And if you were talking about ensuring that home values don't go up, aren't we talking about increasing density? And how does that change the neighborhood and the kind of that character of South LA that you're concerned about?
Well, I think now we see that home values are beyond the realm of affordable to the working class population that has made South Los Angeles great. The people, even more so than the structure. The reality is, if you begin looking at the median household income of nearly every census tract in South Central Los Angeles or South Los Angeles, you won't find one that's above 45,000. Well, not one zip code that's above 45,000, and very few census tracts that even reach the 80% AMI level. So how do you, with the creative class returning and the industries returning, although clearly COVID is either slowing that down or will lead to different discussions and business decisions being made post-COVID. How do you, in that context, maintain economic diversity and cultural diversity in the area, right? And so I think now is where, as we've seen it, it's density, but it's graceful density. It's looking at some of the laws that were recently passed that are the ancestrally drilling units, the granny flats, and seeing this as opportunities to provide those that currently occupy it and basically hit the lottery. Bought the house in 2000 at 200,000. Now it's worth 750, right? By adding the ADU or the backyard unit to it, but restricting it, right, so that it has to go toward affordable housing. And there was a good bill that was passed last year in the state legislature that you're now able to take that single family home lot and have 2 or 3. And so with minimal investment and improvement in the existing structure and creating that second unit, you can take that $600,000 home, turn it into 3 750s, and then clearly it's not this clean, but you've got now 3 properties that families that make up the economic profile of the community now can afford. And I think that's a lot easier than some of the stuff that we see being proposed on the statewide level, and supported, unfortunately, by some officials, where it's basically tear down the single family house and erect a 4 to 8 story condominium project. The 2 makes home ownership opportunities for those who make up the current economic demographics of the area difficult, because now the speculative value of that real estate is unattainable. And so we see that as, in some respects, not just a compromise, but smart strategy. And we already see it being deployed, but we see it being deployed for an exact opposite reason. Now we're going to take that $600,000 house and add the ADU and the unit in the back to create 3 and sell it for 1.2 million. There are opportunities to use the densification laws that have been passed at the state level for creating affordability. It's just not being used in that manner now. Almost, with rare exception, it's being used for the exact opposite, that further pushes out and prices out Black and brown people in the low income that have made up the bulk of South Los Angeles.
So that leads into a question from the audience, which is, would building more housing and encouraging in-migration to Crenshaw and nearby neighborhoods help improve education opportunities for existing residents? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure how building more housing, other than additional tax dollars into the local schools, improves educational opportunities for existing residents. I think those are two separate conversations just in general. It really gets to conversations I know that it's being had on a broader level about Prop 15, which is in trouble right now. I can say that as a person who's a political consultant, but they're probably going to come back next round about the way in which our tax system goes into investment in education. I think it's not so much about building more housing, it's about building the right housing, about building housing that's affordable. Again, pre-COVID numbers, I haven't really looked at the current ones. I mean, and I don't know what utility they would be. But pre-COVID, you were seeing that Los Angeles was over producing the above mod income, the market rate housing, and was drastically underproducing the requisite low income housing, right? And I think that's in so many respects the problem with the dialogue that we have now. It's an either or, and that either or is lots of market rate units at best, a spec level of inclusionary affordable housing, or current circumstances and situations. I've said it over and over again. Propose an 8-story affordable housing complex, and 7's actually better because then you get to use wood as opposed to steel or concrete. Those CLTs on the back end coming up big. Nonetheless, propose that as a fully affordable project that is affordable to the community, and then see what neighbors say, versus what we currently see, which is that 7-8-story building is at best 90% market, 10% unaffordable, 10% affordable, and those 90% of units are not affordable to the local community.
Yeah, and there's, historically, there's been a lot of resistance from the community to rezoning for those larger apartment complexes, which would reduce the cost of housing if enough of them were built, but any one doesn't have as great an impact, right?
Right, and I think also just in general, I mean, I made this point a little bit earlier today on Twitter, where I have fun, sometimes too much fun, I'm going to admit, that, we in Los Angeles, we've got loads of commercial boulevards with underutilized and even vacant commercial space, something that's going to definitely in COVID, post-COVID increase. And again, if you rezone those with strong affordability requirements on site, because those rezonings, and it's already happened, create wealth just through the signature of the mayor, right, and the council members, right. So the return on it, the value capture there should be significant and comparable to the amount of value that's being created. That's an easier challenge. That said, projects that are of large scale that come into historically low-income communities that are catalytic in nature and bring in a completely different class of individuals does impact the currently affordable housing, the naturally occurring affordable housing. And that's where you get to the series of public policies that are necessary and the acquisition funds that are necessary. It's a Rube Goldberg type fix in attempting to accommodate those type of developments. And I honestly don't know any place in the country that's been able to successfully do it. And I've been looking at this intensely for about 4 or 5 years and had loads of conversations with those that both are at UCLA's Displacement Center and in Berkeley, and those across the country. So I think just in general, the orientation that we have, the focus that we have has to change a bit to be just really intentional about this is what the economic profile of the city, of the county is. The market is not building building toward it. Creative solutions that are public-private partnerships to preserve affordability and build more affordable, truly affordable housing need to be created. And seeing these zoning increases, these zoning and density increases laws as an opportunity to do that, less than believing that you can just build a bunch of market rate housing and prices go down. Nothing. I just don't think that's true. And I don't think there are many places that have shown that to be the case.
So assuming that the housing issue is appropriately taken care of, what aspects of tech do you see as being an engine for not just growth, but for opportunity and upward mobility for the folks in underserved communities in Los Angeles?
Well, I mean, especially when you think about the ability to address systemic inequities and systemic negative outcomes for those that are low income. There are programs and apps that are help people. We're having a conversation today about one that helps people monitor their intake, right? And identify cleaner solutions and better food to address their health challenges, right? And so, broadly speaking, that level of detail that and ability to dive in, and the opportunity created by really those that just equipped with the appropriate code and a little VC money can get moving is exciting. And I think those conversations, of which I don't think I'm as qualified as many others to advance, are things that we can look toward. How do we look at these systemic inequities and these horrible outcomes, be they health, be they housing, be they whatever, and use tech to improve them on a much more overt scale, right? We are now seeing largely that this time of conversation about systemic racism is being advanced because everybody's got a camera phone, right? These things have been going on for a very long time, and in the past at much greater number. But the ability of tech to capture it, and ACLU's got a specific app that if you're pulled over, you begin recording it. The ability to capture these things are leading to greater awareness, leading to changes in public policy, advancement in the conversation about a criminal justice system that is, usually would take decades to advance, right? So there's clear things that and real tangible elements of tech that can help specifically those that are marginalized and otherwise are seeing horrible outcomes. But I think to the text, or excuse me, the focus of this conversation in general, when we talk about tech leaders, when we talk about companies, there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done. There's more community listening that needs to be done. And frankly, there are more dollars that just need to be allocated toward, especially those programs that are coming from the grassroots, from those small entrepreneurs who are naturally disadvantaged to their white male peers or their migrant peers.
So at Anderson, we have a program called Global Immersion, which does involve travel, as you know, to other countries as case studies. Obviously, we're not doing that right now. But this last year in 2019, I took a group to Singapore and Bangkok. And in Bangkok, we went to Western Digital. And Western Digital is a foreign, it's a California company, and it has a big factory in Bangkok, but they're the foreigners. And what they've done is they've gone into the local community and they've set up education programs, really soup to nuts. I mean, from the elementary school all the way up. And they've created two things. One is good public will, which as a foreign company is always good. But kind of more importantly, they've created a pipeline of technically astute employees. It's a long run strategy, but it gives them that workforce that they need, not just now, but 10 years from now and 15 years from now. Is that a model that you could see working in underserved communities in Los Angeles, or might it be something else?
I I mean, it's certainly something that's different, and it would make tech's entry into, I mean, people have talked about Silicon South, the former factories that, in some respects fed into the aerospace industry, and just generally Goodyear. The Goodyear track is talked about regularly.
Mhm.
And then obviously West Abs, uh, are the creative industry that's coming in there. They are using light industrial property that had another purpose. And I think in so many respects that, again, the conflict is the industry is coming in because the land is of lower cost than would be to go to Playa Vista or Silicon Beach or these others. Um, but if industry, I mean, and I want to know more about the Western Digital Project. If industry comes in and takes a long game approach, maybe comes in years prior and says this is a factory that is created for the purpose of employing a ridiculously high percentage of the residents that we know are looking for economic mobility. That is something that's very interesting. I think it was changed the conversation, the dialogue. But the permanent perception is you're just coming because the land is cheaper. And you're bringing now a headquarters that's got hundreds, if not thousands of workers, and they got to live somewhere. And so now I, Leimert Park resident, been here for decades, and competing with those that make a significant amount of money more than I, and are competing with those who don't necessarily appreciate the community and the cultural diversity and the uniqueness that the community is in. So I think that is something that people in tech should look into, and the model exists. I mean, you just have to go beyond tech and look at the way in which South LA was built up, and the middle income and the working class did have resources during the last industrial age, not in this current one, right? But again, I think lifting up those examples, having those difficult conversations, those uncomfortable conversations sometimes, and literally, tech's got the money. They've got the resources to come in and say, we're going to buy this part of property and we'll build the factory in X number of years. And prior to that, in our lead in, we're going to create the pipeline program, identify the small businesses that could use some infusion of resources to be our partners. It exists. And again, I can't say it enough. It's just, you wished Apple was doing it themselves. So don't mean it that way. The Bloomfield project that's being done by the Immersion Collective is a model. And we would hope others would be willing to do the same, make that same level of commitment, long-term, long investment in community to help address these systemic problems and chart a new course into our 21st century.
So last question, which is going to be an open question. So tech is growing. You say that there are conversations that are happening. Are you optimistic? Are the firms that you're talking with listening? Are they really thinking in a serious way about spreading the growth in technology and the wealth in technology into underserved communities and creating a situation where a rising tide lifts all boats? Or are their investors pushing them in a different direction? What is your experience there?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna say that it's an ongoing conversation. There are some leaders within tech that I think are listening better than others, but they too have shareholders and boards that they've got to respond to, and it's an organizing campaign. And one of the first things within organizing and building relationships is basic education and research, right? And so I think we are seeing the research dollars come toward addressing this question, taking what has been the narrative and the qualitative data and to quantify it a little bit better, to speak in the language of many of these software engineers. We are seeing that the conversation obviously is advancing, especially now, especially in the context of COVID-19, that's affecting tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people in America, and the underbelly of systemic racism being exposed even further as every, on an economic and on a health outcome, Black and brown folk are being more adversely impacted. And so, of course, in the context of the George Floyd murder, people are listing more. And so I don't want to discount, and I would never suggest that others have not been having this conversation for a very long time. We want to work with them, partner with them, ally with them. But from our conversations, they're new. They are substantive, and we're giving folk time to show us that they're challenging or altering their investments and reevaluating how they see their expansion into communities like ours. And so I want to continue to be in dialogue with it, in dialogue with you, Jerry, and the many others that are in this work. And again, I'm recognizing, and I want to appreciate that people are moving a lot faster than you would typically expect to address these, and are intentional about not just showing performative actions, right? Not just coming in and saying, here's $100 million to these HBCUs and to these Black chambers of commerce, but saying we actually also want to evaluate internally what our system is so that we become an anti-racist organization, and what our commitment can be to be dismantling systemic racism. We're seeing that take place among actors that are serious, and I've got to have hope because, as you've mentioned, and as this conversation has focused us in on this entire conversation this morning, tech is the future, and we can't have a future where that wealth and opportunity continues to be concentrated with those that are already very well privileged. We've got to find a way in which substantively, through control, through dividends, through communication, through all of the things that you would evaluate as to whether something is integrated, that those that are marginalized and those that are Black or brown are part of that future, part of that growth.
Well, that's great. We end on an optimistic note, and these are important topics for the development of the Los Angeles economy. So we look forward to continuing the discussion. Damien, thank you so much for joining us this morning and sharing your thoughts.